All right, well, good afternoon and good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. Let's be equitable geospatially, right? That's important to do, as well as those in the room and those online. Very glad to have you with us. My name is Tim Persons. I'm moderating this session. I had the privilege of being both in the SD and the SESTI operation, and it's where made a lot of delightful acquaintances and friends. We've heard from some of them this morning. It's been a fantastic day thus far. And you've heard about the heat map, which we'll get into a second. But just introducing myself, I'm a partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers. I'm the AI lead for assurance. So how do you bring trust and assurance to AI systems generally? And then also, how do you bring AI into assurance itself, bring it into the audit? So PwC is one of the big four firms. We're regulated, et cetera. So this means a lot. It's a very palpable thing for me. So this is not only an academic exercise, it actually is real. And but I also have a biomedical background. I'm excited about the topic, which is AI and drug discovery. We have a fantastic panel today. I want to get to them quickly, but let's just setting things up, just echoing back what we've heard this morning, is really about how do we inculcate the ethical, social norms, the innovation into our innovation system? How do we get our values and principles aligned? We don't want equity to be a bad word. I remember on the committee, I was just saying, really, when you look at some of these things, you think about the principles of justice and fairness, et cetera, that have been laid out already, autonomy, collective good, individual good. Essentially what we're saying is we want our science and technology system, our innovation system, to be more constitutional, right? That is just honestly the bottom line. How do we just make that the expression of what we do to be for the we the people in the Constitution and so on? And so we have an incredible time, as you all know, the rock that hit the pond, that is the transformer-based architectures, or what's mostly associated with ChatGPT, but there are others out there. Google has its Gemini platform, Anthropic and other vendors are out there, but really are talking about a technology that is the most democratized, and I'll just say this, most hockey sticked. Bob Cook-Deacon's here. He's been around the tech assessment thing before. That used to be in my prior life in the GAO. I was the chief scientist of the GAO replanting tech assessment. But I've never seen a technology that has been so exponential and disruptive in such a short period of time. And a lot of it is it lowered the potential of the energy potential to get access to incredible amounts of computation, like a 1 with a 24 zeros after it kind of size when you do something, and like I was playing around with my first prompts. It's a massive, incredible amount of power, which is both exciting and daunting. And so when you look at and think about what Deborah was saying earlier today, when she was just going over the heat map that the committee put together, is how do we make it more constitutional and do a opportunity and risk narrative? It's important because all technologies, and remember when a scientist says infinitive, all or never, your ears should prick up, but it's always the case that technologies are a double-edged sword. They have an upside, they have a downside. So how do we maximize our upsides? How do we minimize the downsides? We need to recognize it. We need to go through those things. And again, we want to have a more holistic innovation system. So I'll just say, then turning to the panelists, I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves as just part of the protocol here at the academies. We have to ask the question, please disclose any conflicts here so that we make sure the audience understands, are you or are you not conflict, or in whatever financial disclosure relationship there is. I'll start by example because I am in the private sector, but my firm is incredibly independent, so I can confirm to you I have no financial interests or relationship disclosure that's relevant to this discussion. And with that, then I'll turn it over and ask, starting with Linda, then going to Hannah, then Garth if he's on, and then Madeline. We'll go from there. So Linda, I'm going to toss it over to you. Please introduce yourself. More info is in the bios in the back, so please be brief so we can jump into, for all the panelists, so we can jump right into the discussion. Linda.
Hi, yeah, I'm Linda Stewart. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Protein Design at the University of Washington. I'll be giving a brief presentation, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. I have no conflicts.
Thank you. Then Hannah.
Hello, everybody. My name is Hana El Samad. I am a founding principal investigator and senior vice president for innovation at Altus Labs. And as such, my conflict is I hold equity in Altus Labs. Before that, and continuing, I was a professor at the University of California, San Francisco in the Department of Biochemistry and Biophysics. My research interests and mandate at Altus Labs can span technology, data generation technology, and computational biology and AI systems.
And I assume you have no conflicts, correct? Oh, sorry.
My conflict is I hold equity in Altus Labs.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes.
And then over to Garth. Is Garth on? Yes. Hi, Garth.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, good. Garth Graham. I am Global Head of Healthcare and Public Health. I'm at Google and I run YouTube Health. My conflicts are related to working for Google, and I'm also a member of the National Academy of Medicine.
Thank you, Garth. And then Madeline.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Madeline Claire Ellish. I am an anthropologist by training, currently head of responsible AI for Google Cloud, where I do very much the on-the-ground practitioner work of AI governance. So we talked about moving principles into practice. That has been my path. I would think of myself as independent in this conversation. However, I am employed by Google and therefore have those kinds of employment and financial ties.
Thanks very much, ladies and Garth. I appreciate that and for introducing yourselves. Let's kick things off. And what we're going to do is Linda's going to give us a 10-minute overview on what it means for AI use in drug design. For those of you who are Washington observers, especially in AI policy, you'll know that the Executive Order 14110 has a specific clause talking about bringing about equity in terms of AI drug discovery and development. So that's the one on the safe, secure, trustworthy use, design and use of AI systems by the White House. So Linda, over to you. Please kick us off.
Okay, so I'm presenting on behalf of the Institute for Protein Design. The Institute was founded by David Baker in 2012. I work very closely with him. I've been at the Institute for about a year as the executive director. And everything I'm showing you really is made possible by really some brilliant science, but by him and his group. So I'm going to give you like a quick overview of what protein design can do, just because I think this kind of should articulate the upside, I think, and potential benefits. And I'll touch very briefly at the end on some of the security issues. So proteins have really evolved to solve most of the most complex challenges on Earth. We find proteins everywhere. They're in all organic materials, animals, plants, whatever. And each protein really can be considered as a unique machine, a macromolecule with unique functions. An important point is that all proteins are genetically encoded. Their DNA is translated into amino acids, which essentially function like a ball on a string and fold up to have a particular shape. And one of the really grand challenges in biology for the past 50 years has been how can you predict the shape of a protein based only on the genetic code and or the amino acid sequence? And this grand challenge was essentially solved by really the application of artificial intelligence with Google's DeepMind creating AlphaFold in 2021, and soon thereafter ourselves, where we created RosettaFold. And these two algorithms essentially are able to predict protein structure from amino acid or genetic sequence. And this has been game-changing to many degrees. But what I'm going to focus on is what's actually happened since then, which I think has now taken this to a completely new level. And really what the Institute for Protein Design is interested in, and really led by David's vision, is that proteins, have evolved to, there's a unique number of proteins on Earth. There are about 10 to the 15 proteins on Earth. But that if we could design new proteins, we would actually be able to tap into this almost infinite space of potential solutions to problems that we haven't yet been able to do, and that the unlocking of protein design would really unlock this vast universe of solutions for drugs, medicines, and all sorts of other issues. So that's really been the goal of the Institute. And the protein design problem is actually the opposite of the protein structure prediction problem. For protein design, you have a structure. You need to be able to create a shape. That shape needs to is encoded by an amino acid sequence and then a genetic sequence. And the ability to define the desired shape is actually one of the big problems that's kind of been the barrier for protein design. And this has essentially been again unlocked by artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms. And really how we do it at the Institute is actually we bring together not one or two, but three different AI machine learning algorithms. So they were actually discovered in reverse order or developed in reverse order, but how we use them is RF diffusion is a generative AI algorithm that is able to create new protein structures. Protein MPNN can be used to assign amino acids that we think will fold to that structure. And then we use Rosetta fold or AlphaFold as an oracle to say whether we have in fact created or the shapes that we think we have. And then we go off and we express those in the lab. And from that, we can test them for particular functions. And before I go into some of the applications, I'll just quickly go through the diffusion model because everybody, I think people are starting to understand diffusion models now, but I think it's important to understand how they work in the context of protein design. So a diffusion model essentially is a probabilistic network where you take an image, for instance, in DALL-E, you add Gaussian noise, so you get a pixelated image until it's completely pixelated, and you train an algorithm to add noise. You can then tell that algorithm to run that algorithm in reverse, and you go from a pixelated picture to a picture of a cat, or you can give it a particular prompt. I need a green cat or a red cat or whatever. And that's how diffusion models essentially work. So we have done exactly the same, but training instead on the protein database, so the PDB. We've trained on every protein within the protein database, and Rosetta Fold was essentially trained to create Gaussian noise, which in this case is sort of an amino acid cloud shown on the left. And we can then use this diffusion algorithm, run it in reverse and say, create me a protein shape or a protein shape that has a particular structure or function. So that's how the algorithm actually, that's a kind of simplistic version of the algorithm. There's clearly more nuance to it than that. But for the purposes of this, what we are now able to do with these tools is we're able to create a number of different biologics and vaccines. And I'll just give you some examples and show you some examples of what we can do using this diffusion-based workflow. So starting first on the left, we're super interested in Gaurav Bhardwaj in the Institute is interested in peptide design. He's interested particularly in peptide design here for antimicrobial resistant organisms. And what he has done is actually was trying to design a peptide against a protein on A. baumannii surface. This protein actually didn't have a solved crystal structure, so he used AlphaFold to predict a structure, and then he designed a peptide against that predicted structure. And so what you have here is this unusual situation where we're actually now able to create drugs to structures that we don't even know what the structure is formally. And shown on the right, you can see this is actually a low nanomolar binder, and we have other examples of designing against predicted structures. So this is just one example of what we can do with peptide design. David has been working on mini binder design. So these are small proteins, are about 60, 70 amino acids. These are mini binders that bind, for instance, to the amyloid and tau proteins that are create fibrils in Alzheimer's. And these binders are highly potent. And if you add them, as shown on the right, if you add them to monomeric amyloid or tau, they can actually prevent fibril formation. clearly having potential implications in Alzheimer's and moving those into drug development. David's also been working on monoclonal antibody design. So monoclonals, as you know, are the most common type of drug coming to the market. And shown on the left is that a diffusion of a nanobody for targeting the hemagglutinin stem protein. And when we solve the cryo-EM of that designed protein, the cryo structure is shown in the design structure is shown in purple, and the actual cryo is shown in gray, demonstrating that we can design antibodies on a computer. Neil King, who's been working in the group, works on vaccine design. He's been working on using computational models for really tricky antigens. Here's the HIV envelope protein, which is extremely difficult to work with. It's highly flexible stalk protein, and what Neil was able to do is to replace GP41 with a novel, a new completely AI-generated protein that holds the apex of the HIV envelope correctly orientated, so that it can bind to the broadly neutralizing antibodies, VRC1 shown in green. And so this allows sort of precision of design for immunogens that are really, really very difficult. He's gone on to work on nanoparticle design. So we're particularly interested in scaffolding immunogens on multi-component nanoparticles, because that valency increases their potency. And this is a nanoparticle that has been specifically tailored to display class 1 fusion proteins, in this case RSVF. The same nanoparticle can also probably display Nipah, Hendra, Langya, so a lot of infectious disease vaccines that are of pandemic potential. And as I started with, I sort of implied that everything that a protein does is essentially genetically encoded. So one thing that is possible with everything I've shown you is that it is possible to marry the power of protein design with the speed of RNA. So we're looking at this in the context of vaccines, clearly, but also for any biologic, we were potentially able to use mRNA as a rapid translational tool to test these in preclinical and clinical development. So we think this really speaks to how AI-enabled vaccine design would be really critical in the context of biological outbreaks or bioweapons or pandemic outbreaks of any origin, because we can bring these together. We also see, of course, there's enormous opportunity for AI design for many, many diseases and neurodegeneration, autoimmunity, cancer. So we have programs in the Institute applying protein design across this whole spectrum of medical applications. And I think one thing, and we also beyond medicines are working in sustainability, technology, and so on. So there are many other applications I've not talked about. I've just really been focusing on the medical applications here. But one thing that we became very aware of in, about a year ago, or just when we realized the power of these tools, is the fact that they did have dual use potential, and that we were quite concerned that they might be abused in some way. So last fall, we brought together a set of experts to really help us think through how best to responsibly kind of deploy and use these AI biodesign tools. And we had researchers, AI researchers, we had representatives from government, funders, philanthropy, ethicists, policy professionals, and so on, including 2 members of the President's Council of Advisors for Science and Technology. We had a really, I think, very important conversation, and really came away with 3 main takeaways. So the first was we have established some community guidelines for all people who are using AI protein design tools. Those guidelines are now published and have been signed by about probably now 200 researchers in the field, and really committing to responsible use of these tools. We have coordinated with the DNA synthesis community and the security community to ensure that we are talking to each other, and that the DNA screening capabilities are kind of aware of trying to accommodate the advances in protein design. And then the final sort of part of this responsible AI effort has been really to try and ensure that we highlight the benefits of AI by design for biosecurity and for biological medical countermeasures. And there is a commitment from the community to apply themselves very specifically to these positive aspects of application of the tools. So I will stop there. I have not talked about small molecule design. Clearly, there's AI efforts in other parts of the drug discovery arena, but I'm sure others better suited to speak to that. I'll just stop and thanks, and hope that's helped frame a little bit of the conversation.
That's fantastic, Linda. We'll clap. Give her. We don't know if the sound filtered out, but we want to make sure you were appreciated. Thank you so much for that walkthrough. Just as a moderator's prerogative for a moment, I also wanted to help frame the issue just with a little bit of the numbers, okay? Because when you think about the context, I'll just talk about the US, but there is a global story to this. So right now we're at what's called peak boomer. 11,200 boomers turn age of 65 every day, okay? And we'll continue to inexorably march to the right for almost the next decade on that. So when you look at that, you're talking about in our country and then around the world, when I grew up, the big scare disease was cancer, right? Today, what's emerging is Alzheimer's or various forms of dementia, which right now costs about $1/3 of $1 trillion in the US and will be rising by 2050 to $1 trillion a year and more worldwide. So phenomenal expenses on that. This just goes right to why the importance of what Linda is talking about and the discovery of these things. I know this isn't the GLP session, that's the other room, but the obesity thing is even worse, right? We're going by 2035 to about 3% of global GDP because of the percentage of people in the world that are obese. So we have a major, not only US, particularly US, major problem. So it's in that context where we need machine speed solutions to be able to not only discover these drugs like what Linda is doing in AlphaFold and that incredible work, but also develop those, to develop rapidly and so on. So I wanted to turn to the panelists in that context then and start the discussion really just asking about affording access to this. How do you get expertise to this when you really are thinking about the language model-based or transformer architectures are consuming, you can measure really more in the power generation needs. The data centers in Virginia have gone up by 16% because of the need for compute and data and so on. And so this sounds like, even though I was saying before, the chat windows lowers the barrier. You don't have to be a Stanford computer scientist in order to do it. On the other hand, you do have to have the right data, the right prompting, the right understanding and knowledge about how to take something and to rapidly push it through the design and the development process. So why don't I just open it up to the panel, but Hannah, if you don't mind just starting off, because I know Altos does some really important work on rejuvenation of cells and things like that, and you come at it from a smaller perspective, although we hope this whole sector succeeds. And then I want to turn to folks from Google as well.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I think you hit the nail on the head. So I'm going to start from the beginning and say that in addition to the availability of talent, there are three factors that figure in every large-scale AI enterprise. That is data, compute, and scaling. I'm going to leave data aside for now because, and I hope we come back to it because that's important, because most of the advances we saw at large-scale advances in let's say, protein design and protein folding area has come from public data, and we need to acknowledge that. That's probably not going to be the case for the next generation, and we need to discuss that, but let's leave data aside. Let's talk about compute and scaling, the engineering of these systems. Let's put the big players on the table, because I think that helps answers your question about what's required. So there's AlphaFold, that's Google DeepMind. There's ESMFold, that's Meta AI, the parent company of Facebook. There's the Institute for Protein Design, of course, the Rosetta Fold and the diffusion models they have. You've probably seen the big headlines of AI can rewrite the human genome of 2 weeks ago. That's Salesforce, the spin-off company from Salesforce who did the CRISPR. I can keep going on and on. There are 4 or 5 companies that are doing, I would say, upward of 95%, and Institute of Protein Design, that do upward of 95% of current innovation in this field.
And so that's the
That's a big-
infrastructural piece.
That's the
right.
infrastructural
Yes.
piece. So, and the common theme across them, whether that's in the private sector or the public sector, is consolidation of resources. Very large resources, there's a huge barrier to entry.
Okay.
In my mind, in compute and scaling, very soon to be data also, as we exhaust the public repositories and we start collecting new data. In my mind, that's the biggest problem we have to face today. That is a challenge. You mentioned, Altus Labs. This is a challenge we also have, is data compute scaling, barrier to entry, even with a very largely funded biotech such as Altus Labs.
Thank you. I want to go online to toss it over to Garth. Just any perspectives on that, again, in your key role at Google and as a National Academy member as well, because I know you've been thinking about this, working on this. What are your insights that you have from Google?
Can you speak a little louder, please? We couldn't hear you.
Yes, sorry. Can you hear me better now?
Yes. Say that one more time.
Just pulling you into the discussion, Garth, on how are you thinking about this from the Alphabet Google perspective?
Yeah, so I think, especially with AlphaFold 3 and our ability to even more define protein infrastructure, there is just tremendous amount of opportunity, not just in terms of disease processes we talked about here, but in terms of even others and kind of the evolution of that. I think the question, as the concept that was just talked about in terms of data availability and certainly the major players is one aspect. AI expertise is another kind of important aspect in terms of having the right kinds of folks and the skilled personnel that kind of bring these things into fruition. But I would say from the kind of broader Alphabet perspective, a lot of focus has gone into how do you channel and funnel that expertise into the kind of opportunities that we just talked about in the presentation, but also even some that aren't even kind of made its way to the forefront. I will say, once you go past the concept of kind of resource and infrastructure, you start to get into some of the other kind of broader influences in this sphere, not just in terms of market force and industry trends, but looking a lot on the societal and geopolitical influences from public health priorities and national research agendas and kind of the intersection of collaboration and competition across some of the players that you just said. So I think for what I would say in terms of from the Alphabet perspective, I think a lot of it is, thinking through the opportunities, the concepts that really to deliver a lot of the change that's needed at scale. But then when you take a step back and kind of peel back the onion around what's needed, I think the data and the people are one part of it, but then also understanding the intersection of kind of not just market forces and trends, but the societal and geopolitical influences as well.
Yeah, thanks, Garth. I want to come back to the data in a moment, but I want to go over to Madeline as well, and just from a responsible AI perspective, what are your thoughts on this? This is about, again, building inequity and responsibility in the AI development, and Google is a big player, clearly.
Yeah, so I think that really important concerns are raised about the compute that's needed, the centralization of those resources, and I think that we as a multi-stakeholder community have to do better to think about how do we solve these problems, because I think it is a real challenge that we need to acknowledge. I think it is a challenge that I will say from the kind of governance and innovation perspective, we at Google, the researchers at DeepMind, try and think carefully about And I think it's, weighing sort of risks and benefits of being sure that the technology that we release will be used for good and won't be used for malicious purposes, especially as we, release more and more advanced technologies. So how do you sort of weigh transparency and safety? I think we're all sort of trying to figure out what are the norms that we as a scientific community should be adhering to. I think also at Google and DeepMind, we've worked on having sort of structural ways to increase engagement and participation with expert communities, using expert very broadly, in the sense that many different communities of practice and lived experience are experts in their own rights. And so we're building in ways to incorporate different voices, different modes of participation in the development process. That is a challenge. I'm not saying that we have it perfect at all, but it is something that is on our mind, that was part of the development of AlphaFold 3, and I think was part of what also drove the sort of first version that we released of the AlphaFold server platform, which is meant to enable folks who don't have access to compute or necessarily ML expertise to conduct non-commercial research that could hopefully advance the field. So those are some of the things we're thinking about from the sort of innovation process and governance perspective.
And do you think, just a quick follow-up, just because you've seen the framework, right? We're on the committee, we're not looking for compliments or anything, we're just looking, as we try and operationalize it, how might we, and I'm in the private sector now too, so this is all, how do we come at this from a private sector perspective so that it's not viewed as some thou shalt or regulatory or it's a lecture on equity? We want to think about how do you get better products, move things better, do more broader good, et cetera, in line with the company's mission, vision, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge that, in the public sector, in the private sector, in academia, we're all working toward. I think that having more conversations like this, where it's multi-stakeholder input, can help sort of get us to practical frameworks that could sort of, we can figure out how do they mesh with forthcoming regulatory expectations or other requirements that are coming that then frankly companies will need to find ways, like if it can come, I think, from both a regulatory perspective and also from a changing norms perspective. So it's, I don't have any perfect solutions, just that we're moving in the right direction.
Right, as the saying goes, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So,
in
any case, yes, you will absolutely confirm that. Probably lived experience.
Then can I add something?
Yes,
to
please
that?
jump in.
I
Hannah,
actually want
yes.
to jump back to something that Congressman Foster said this morning, which is we don't want to kill the golden goose. Right now, the source of innovation is in AI at scale is coming from the private sector, and that's a fantastic thing. Now the question in front of us is how do we build private-public partnerships that allow that to amplify rather than stemming it back. And I think the tone here matters, actually. And I think this is what you were trying to convey, but I wanted to be very explicit about it. The
please.
tone matter, the intentions matter, the positive intent matters, and I think this is why we're all here. Actually, I on the plane here, relevant to this, I was reading the report that the President's Councils of Advisors on Science and Technology just issued, actually, in April, on the issue of AI and recommendations to the President. And one of the main recommendations to the President was foster private-public relationships and true collaborations in the area of AI, especially for health and biomedicine.
Right.
So it's a tall order, but we need to do it. I don't think there is any other way forward.
So if you mind holding questions, we need to do a couple more things, and we'll come back to it. But I wanted to pull on this thread and then go back to Linda on this just to start. But thinking about data as a public good, because we're hearing about the data, and of course there's this thing about public access to data, right? You heard the NIH director spoke well this morning, and she mentioned that it's a requirement now for this research you have to publish your data. That's great. But is that still enough? She mentioned the National Library of Medicine, right? As fantastic as NIH has been, their culture has been biomedical, but it's also this getting into computational thinking at the same time in this convergent world that we're in. So are we doing enough to get data out there? But at the same time, and that's at times is cross purposes with so much of the IP or the intellectual property is embedded in the data and what these discovery companies, there are companies just doing discovery, not doing development. Some are doing both, and some are doing just development. So there's this whole spectrum. How do we think about data as a public good and have our cake and eat it too, so to speak, with respect to that? So let me just go to Linda, because Linda, I know your research, your leadership, your institute is based upon getting that. Are we doing enough? Are we thinking about data as an infrastructure? Is there more to be done? And then we'll go to the private sector voices as well.
Yeah, maybe I'll comment also on the last topic as well.
Please, yes.
So the Institute we have a very strong position or on open access. And so we release all our code open. Currently it's all been released openly to nonprofits and academics, on GitHub as a pretty open permissive license. And part of that is from our learnings from Rosetta, which was the prior kind of version of all of this, where the community came together around that. And there was a lot of people who contribute code and improvements. And I think we believe that this sort of crowdsourcing of innovation and bright minds is actually really important to accelerating fields. And, we openly released Rosetta Fold, and, I think that probably did I don't know, but, AlphaFold then did get released openly as well. And I think it speaks to what the kind of acceleration that you can enable by openly sharing things. And I think the question then is this balance of doing so with, but maintaining security and also preventing the sort of consolidation that is at risk here, right? It is a risk that this is going to end up being tools and technology that is only for the, essentially rich, privileged with large amount of compute resources. And we're interested in having access, not just equitable within the US, but also we feel that these tools are particularly important in low and middle income countries who might want to use them for infectious diseases and outbreaks and so on. So I think open access is a sort of fundamental principle on which we work. And that, coming back to the data, is partly our principle around open access is also because we have benefited from the amazing resource that was the PDB. And everybody put all of their proteins in the protein database, and that was what we were able to train on. Moving forward, right, we are generating an enormous amount of data currently on designed proteins. That data, we actually are trying to work out what to do with that data. How do we archive that? How do we create data repositories so that this would then become a resource for the field for people to train on and to continue to work. And so we need data, but we also need we don't need everybody's data, we need the right type of data. But we would like that data to continue to be made openly available. And if we consolidate again into the private sector, then that won't be possible. And so, again, how do we drive a kind of norms and standards where these things are shared and people understand that data is for the global good, not get too proprietary about things.
Yeah.
So.
And Garth, what's your perspective on the data and net access?
Yeah, so I think they brought up a really good point. I'll take it from two angles. I think certainly the private sector efforts you see now around data availability is what I would say is probably kind of the the earlier versions of this as we grow and learn more. Certainly advances from the PDB has been beneficial in other contexts. You have other public databases, PubChem, UniPro, other kind of sources that are good to be strengthened along in this process. and thinking through not just the private databases, but then again, ways to kind of fortify the public databases. One of the other hats I wear in life is I'm on the advisory committee for the NIH director. And we've been doing a lot of work, particularly around Henrietta Lacks and the history of even that as a more as an earlier version of how we bring databases in an incorrect manner and kind of bring a lot of these things into the public sector appropriately. And the reason I say that is that has borne a lot of fruit, even though it started in a not so good place. And I would say this idea of even thinking about funding agencies, government and philanthropic organizations, and how you kind of bring those on board to scale are a part of it. So I would say certainly I think some of the efforts that you just described in the private sector to be I would say I would consider those some of the earlier efforts. But I think to take this to scale, we have to think through again some of the other data repositories and even some of the funding agencies and how you kind of bring that on board.
Okay, thank you. Madeline or Hannah, do you have any comments on this? Although I wanted to jump to one final quick round, and then we're going to go to the floor for questions, including online.
So I'm going to bring up something about data collection that I think is going to be very important moving forward. And this has to do with the conversation about lab in the loop, self-driving labs, or that use or don't use adaptive or reinforcement learning. So there also the barrier to entry. So the first, thank you all taxpayers for producing the data we trained our first models on. The next generation of data, as Linda mentioned also, is going to be trained on data collected de novo for the purposes of training models. It's going to be vast, it's going to be rich, it's going to be deep. It's going to be generated probably by automated systems, by robots, by really, self-driving labs. The cost of that is tremendous. So who's going to pay for that? Who's going to be able to afford collecting these data? And when they do, where is it going to sit? Who has jurisdiction over it? So the volume of the data collected is going to increase so tremendously with automation that now is the time to ask the questions about the data.
And I'll just also point out, just again, having looked at this, it's one thing to do, again, it's both the AI for drug discovery, right, like what's going on, and then there's the development piece, which is a whole another set of slings and arrows to de-risk, right? It's one thing to find the lock and the key, it's another thing to know biochemically or pharmacokinetically how it's going to work, et cetera. So that kind of thing is another piece. But Madeline, you want to jump in? Otherwise, I'm just going to go to the last question. So imagine 10 years from now, right, sitting where we are, having the tools we have, like this framework, again, however perfect or imperfect it is, in the future, how we might be able to look back and say, where would things have gone wrong? What steps could we have done today to be able to do that? This is a foresight exercise. So again, it's pure speculation in one sense, but I just wanted to ask the panel. So Madeline, what would you say to that?
Sure, I love this question because you get to be both critical and potentially positive and forward-looking. So I think bringing back to really the center of health equity as a theme for the day, I think something that I worry about is jumping on the AI bandwagon too quickly and too heavily. If that is a byproduct of that is that we defund other initiatives at the expense of focusing on technology, particularly including defunding, some of the slow, on-the-ground, human-centered work that advances health equity, like listening to underserved communities, articulating what problems actually need to be solved, not just that can be solved by AI, and building trust with communities, which was also something that came up this morning. So I think what I sort of worry about, what I hope that we don't do, is push all funding toward AI possibilities and defund other initiatives. And that instead that we take this moment as an opportunity to have a conversation about what are all of the steps that we need to take to advance health equity in this moment of profound technology.
technologies.
Thank you. Linda, do you have any perspective on this question? Linda, can you? Oh,
Were you asking me?
yes.
Sorry.
Do you have
Yeah.
what's your
Of course, I have a perspective on the
Thank you.
future.
Okay. I was hoping you'd say yes. Thank you.
Yeah, the future is bright, but we have made some mistakes on the way. I think one mistake is to allow a consolidation only into the private sector. I do think these tools are unbelievably useful, powerful, and I feel really strongly in the AI for good potential for advancing, human health and climate and all the other things. And what I worry about is that 10 years from now, we've somehow prematurely allowed a consolidation into the private sector, which has actually both fragmented it and slowed the innovation and applications, particularly applications to things that are not commercially valuable. So we are very interested in the Institute in how do we advance our public health vaccines. We have HIV, malaria vaccines in our portfolio. These are all things that would not necessarily be developed in the private sector. So I think being equitable also means retaining open accessibility at least for as long as possible. The other mistakes I think we could make are not anticipating soon enough that as you open up the sort of faucet of discovery, you then create another bottleneck further downstream, which is in development and regulatory and all of those things. And so to maximize the sort of speed of application of the tools, we need to think about how do we get regulators familiar with them for product development, for clinical trial development, and so on, and start getting ahead of that now. So those would be the two things I would probably worry about. But the future is bright. We should be optimistic.
Yes, thank you. Garth or Hannah, do you have any quick perspectives? Otherwise, I wanted to quickly get to the floor. I have a couple questions here. We will go online also to make sure that if any hands are raised, that we're aware of any online questions that come up. So.
Oh, sorry, I was speaking. I forgot to unmute myself. I agree with Linda about the brightness of the future. Certainly, worry about exacerbated health disparities, challenges with data bias and, how that may play out, issues around transparency and accountability. And, coming from a family of frontline workers who, worked in the auto industry and other places, a job displacement as automation takes hold is always a challenge. But I do think that the opportunities for faster and cheaper drug development, personalized medicine, novel therapeutics, and sustainable solutions are there. And so more on the bright side of the future, but recognize the challenges.
Thank you.